The padlock was on the ground. The chain was cut. The root cellar door was wide open, spilling light into the Tennessee night. And crouched inside, between my shelves of canned tomatoes, smoked venison, and 60 pounds of raw honey, was the HOA president from the subdivision next door, a woman who had spent 6 months trying to enforce her neighborhood rules on property she didn't own, filed 3 bogus complaints with the county, and finally decided that if the government wouldn't shut down my cellar, she'd inspect it herself, with bolt cutters, at 10 o'clock at night, on my land, behind my fence, through my barbed wire. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I walked up those stone steps, grabbed that 3-inch oak door, swung it shut, and dropped the steel crossbar into place. Then I sat on my tailgate and waited for the blue lights. Would you have done the same? My name is Everett Hale. I'm 51 years old, and I live on a 46-acre homestead in the eastern hills of Polk County, Tennessee, about 20 minutes south of the Hiwassee River. My grandfather built the main house in 1961 with timber he cut from the ridge behind the property. My father added the barn in 1978. I added the root cellar in 2016, a traditional below-grade stone and concrete structure built into the hillside behind the house, designed to store preserved food at a consistent 55 degrees year-round. It's the kind of thing people in these hills have been building for 200 years. The cellar is 12 feet by 16, dug 4 feet into the slope with reinforced concrete block walls, a poured concrete floor, and a vaulted ceiling framed with pressure-treated lumber, and topped with 18 inches of packed earth and sod. The door is solid oak, 3 inches thick, hung on blacksmith-forged strap hinges I bought from a craftsman in Copper Hill. There's a steel crossbar on the outside for securing it during storms, and a hasp with a padlock for everyday security. Inside, I've got floor-to-ceiling shelving on 3 walls, holding mason jars of canned vegetables, fruit preserves, pickled peppers, smoked venison, dried herbs, and about 60 pounds of honey from my own hives. That cellar isn't a hobby. It's how I eat through winter. The trouble started in 2019 when a developer named Ridgepoint Communities bought 200 acres of former pasture land on the north side of my property and built a subdivision called Creekstone Manor. 144 homes on half-acre lots with a clubhouse, a fishing pond, and an HOA that governed everything from fence height to the color of your front doormat. The HOA president was a woman named Sandra Devlin, late 40s, short auburn hair, drove a pearl-white Lexus RX that she parked like she owned whatever pavement it touched. She and her husband, Keith, moved to Creekstone from Knoxville in 2020, and within 8 months, Sandra had installed herself as president of the Homeowners Association, with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd been preparing for the role her entire life. Sandra ran Creekstone Manor like a personal fiefdom. She had a laminated copy of the CC and Rs in her car, a violation pad in her purse, and an unshakable belief that her authority extended well beyond the subdivision's actual boundaries. The problem was, my homestead sat adjacent to the subdivision's western edge. My property line ran along the back of 6 Creekstone lots, and Sandra had decided that what I did on my own land was somehow her business. I never signed an HOA agreement. I never bought a lot in Creekstone. My land predates that subdivision by 60 years. But none of that seemed to matter to Sandra Devlin, who looked at my root cellar, my beehives, my chicken coop, and my smokehouse, and saw violations waiting to be written. The first contact came in March of 2022. I found a letter in my mailbox, not from the post office, hand-delivered, on Creekstone Manor HOA letterhead. It was addressed to property owner and signed by Sandra Devlin, president. The letter informed me that my outbuildings were visible from Creekstone common areas, and that their appearance and condition were inconsistent with the aesthetic standards of the surrounding community. It requested that I screen or remove the structures within 60 days. I read it standing at the end of my driveway, folded it into thirds, and put it in my back pocket. Then I walked back inside and threw it in the kitchen trash. The letter had no legal standing. My property wasn't part of Creekstone. Their CC and Rs didn't apply to me. And Sandra Devlin had exactly as much authority over my root cellar as I had over the President of France. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived. Same letterhead, same signature. This one was more specific. It cited my root cellar by name, described as an unapproved underground storage facility, and claimed it posed a potential safety hazard to Creekstone residents whose lots backed up to my property. It demanded that I submit construction plans to the Creekstone Architectural Review Committee for retroactive approval or face enforcement action. I didn't throw this one away. I called my attorney, a woman named Patrice Holloway, who practiced property law out of a converted farmhouse in Benton. Patrice had handled my boundary survey in 2017 and was the kind of lawyer who wore jeans to depositions and won them anyway. I read her the letter over the phone. She was silent for about 5 seconds, then said, "Everett, this woman is trying to enforce her HOA rules on property that isn't in her HOA. That's not just wrong, it's legally meaningless. Don't respond. Let me handle it." Patrice sent a 1-page letter to Sandra Devlin by certified mail. It was polite, professional, and devastating. It stated that my property was not part of the Creekstone Manor subdivision, that I had never signed or been subject to any HOA covenants, that the root cellar was built with a valid Polk County building permit issued in 2016, and that any further correspondence implying HOA jurisdiction over my property would be treated as harassment. The letter concluded by noting that I had the right to pursue legal action if the HOA continued to direct enforcement communications to a non-member property owner. Sandra's response came 10 days later. Not a letter, a visit. I was in the garden pulling weeds from the bean rows when I heard a car door close at the top of my driveway. I looked up and saw Sandra walking toward me in khaki pants and a Creekstone Manor polo shirt, holding her clipboard and wearing the expression of a woman who believed her clipboard was a badge. She introduced herself. I told her I knew who she was. She said she'd received a letter from my attorney and wanted to discuss the matter neighbor to neighbor. I told her I appreciated the gesture, but that the letter was clear. My property, my rules. Sandra tilted her head and said, "Mr. Hale, I understand your position, but the residents of Creekstone Manor have legitimate concerns about structures on adjacent properties that affect their property values and safety. That underground storage building of yours, no one knows what's in there. For all we know, it could be storing chemicals or attracting pests." I told her it was storing canned tomatoes and smoked deer meat. She wrote something on her clipboard. I asked her what she was writing. She said, "Notes." I told her she was welcome to leave. She said, "I'll be following up with the county." I said, "You do that." She walked back to her Lexus, and I went back to pulling weeds. But something about the way she'd looked past me, toward the root cellar, partially visible on the hillside behind the house, stayed with me. She wasn't looking at the garden. She was looking at the door. Sandra did follow up with the county. 2 weeks after her visit, I received a call from the Polk County Code Enforcement Office. A man named Gary Bledsoe, decent guy, I'd met him at the co-op, said he'd received a complaint about an unpermitted underground structure on my property and was required to follow up with an inspection. I told Gary the root cellar was permitted. I gave him the permit number from 2016. He looked it up in the system while I was on the phone and said, "Yep, I see it right here." Permit issued April 2016. Final inspection passed September 2016. "You're good, Everett." I asked him who filed the complaint. He said he couldn't disclose that, but he paused just long enough for us both to know. Gary closed the complaint as unfounded. But Sandra wasn't done. Over the next 2 months, she filed 3 more complaints with the county. The first alleged that my root cellar was a potential environmental hazard due to possible chemical storage. Gary sent an inspector, a young woman named Kelly, who spent 20 minutes looking at my shelves of mason jars, said, "This is actually really impressive," asked me for my pickled pepper recipe, and filed a report stating no hazardous materials were found. The second complaint alleged that my beehives, 3 Langstroth hives set up along the south fence line, were a public nuisance that posed a stinging hazard to Creekstone residents. The county's response was a form letter stating that beekeeping was a protected agricultural activity under Tennessee Code annotated, and that no enforcement action was warranted. The third complaint was the most creative. Sandra alleged that my root cellar was an attractive nuisance that could lure children from the adjacent subdivision onto my property. She included photographs, taken from the Creekstone side of the fence, showing the cellar door from a distance. Gary called me about this one. He sounded tired. He said, "Everett, she sent photos. The cellar is 50 yards from the property line, behind a locked gate, on the back side of a hill. I'm closing this one too." 3 complaints, 3 closures. 0 violations. But Sandra was spending her energy, and mine, on a campaign that had no legal basis. I asked Patrice what my options were. She said, "You can send another letter, you can file a harassment complaint, or you can wait for her to make a real mistake." I chose to wait. Meanwhile, I noticed something that bothered me. Twice in April, I found boot prints on the trail that runs along the eastern side of my property, the side closest to the creekstone fence line. The prints were small, maybe a women's size 8, with a tread pattern that looked like hiking boots. They led from the fence line, where someone had clearly climbed through the barbed wire, down the slope toward the root cellar, and then back up. The first time, I told myself it could be a hiker who'd gotten turned around. The second time, I found the same boot prints at the base of the cellar steps, right in front of the door. Someone had walked up to my root cellar, stood there long enough to leave deep impressions in the soft earth, and then walked back to the fence. I didn't have proof it was Sandra, but I had a feeling. And I'd learned a long time ago that when a feeling and a boot print point the same direction, you should start paying attention. I drove to the sporting goods store in Cleveland the next morning and bought 2 trail cameras, Stealth Cam G Series, infrared, motion activated, with cellular connectivity. I mounted one on a pine tree with a clear view of the cellar door, and another on the fence post nearest the spot where the boot prints crossed the barbed wire. Both cameras sent alerts directly to my phone. Then I replaced the padlock on the cellar door with a heavier one, a Medico high-security padlock that couldn't be cut with standard bolt cutters, and added a case-hardened chain rated at 12,000 pounds of tensile strength. If someone wanted to get into my root cellar, they were going to need more than a pair of garden shears. The trail cameras paid for themselves inside of a week. On a Wednesday evening in May, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the fence line camera. I opened the app and watched a 30-second clip that made my blood pressure spike. Sandra Devlin, wearing dark jeans, a navy windbreaker, and hiking boots, climbed through the barbed wire fence at the exact spot where I'd found the boot prints. She paused on the other side, looked both ways, and then walked down the slope toward my property with the confidence of someone who'd done it before. The second camera picked her up 40 seconds later. She walked down the trail, around the back of the house, which was dark, since I was at a church supper in Copper Hill, and straight to the root cellar door. She stood in front of it for about 2 minutes, examining the new padlock and chain. She took photos with her phone. She tugged on the chain once. Then she turned around and walked back up the slope toward the fence. I saved the footage, both clips, time-stamped, GPS tagged, automatically backed up to the cloud. Then I called Patrice. Patrice watched the footage on her laptop the next morning. She said, "Everett, that's criminal trespass. Tennessee Code 39-14-405. She entered your property without permission, through a barrier, barbed wire, and approached a secured structure. If you want to press charges, you have a solid case." I told Patrice I wanted to wait, not because I was being generous, because Sandra hadn't tried to open the cellar yet. She'd only looked at the lock, and I had a feeling she was going to come back with better tools. Patrice nodded and said, "Then we document and prepare. When she crosses the line from trespass to burglary, the charges double." Over the next 3 weeks, Sandra came onto my property 2 more times. The pattern was the same. Wednesday evenings when I was usually out. She climbed the fence, walked to the cellar, inspected the door, and left. The trail cameras caught every visit. I watched the footage each time like a hunter watching a deer trail, looking for the change in pattern that would tell me when she was ready to make her move. During that time, I made my own preparations. I called Earl Gunter, a retired locksmith in Ducktown, and asked him about the Medico padlock. Earl said the lock itself was nearly pick-proof, but the hasp it hung on was the weak point. A good pair of 36-inch bolt cutters could shear through a standard hasp in 3 seconds. He recommended I upgrade to a shrouded hasp, a steel housing that enclosed the padlock shackle, making it impossible to reach with cutters. I bought one from Earl's shop and installed it that weekend. But I also added something else. I installed a heavy oak crossbar on the outside of the cellar door, a 4-inch by 4-inch white oak beam that dropped into steel brackets bolted through the door frame. When the crossbar was in place, the door couldn't be opened from the inside. The crossbar was a traditional storm feature. Root cellars in this part of Tennessee have used them for generations to keep doors from blowing open in high winds. But it had another function that I was now very much aware of. If someone was inside the cellar and someone else dropped that crossbar into place, The person inside wasn't going anywhere. I also upgraded the trail cameras. I added a third camera directly above the cellar door, mounted under the eave of the earth-covered roof. This one had night vision, audio recording, and live streaming capability. I could watch my cellar door in real time from my phone, day or night. Finally, I filed a formal trespass complaint with the Polk County Sheriff's Office. I brought the trail camera footage, all 5 clips, on a flash drive. Deputy Trent Wheeler reviewed the footage, confirmed the woman was identifiable, and filed a report. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I said not yet. He said, "When you're ready, call this number. We'll come fast." I put the deputy's card in my wallet. I checked the crossbar. I checked the cameras. And I waited. It happened on a Friday night in late May. I'd worked a double shift at the lumber mill and came home just after 10. The house was dark. The ridgeline behind the property was black against a sky full of stars. I pulled my truck into the gravel pad, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, in the quiet the way you do when you're bone tired, and the world finally stops moving. Then I saw the light. A thin beam, flickering and unsteady, was coming from inside the root cellar. The door was standing open, not halfway, fully open, hinged back against the earthen wall, spilling a wedge of light onto the stone steps. I reached under the seat and pulled out my phone. The trail camera app showed the last alert, triggered 42 minutes earlier. I opened the clip. Sandra Devlin, same dark windbreaker, same hiking boots, carrying a flashlight and a small backpack. She climbed the fence. She walked to the cellar. But this time, she didn't just look at the lock. She knelt down, opened the backpack, and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. Heavy-duty, long-handled, the kind you buy at a tool supply store. She worked on the hasp for about 90 seconds before cutting through the chain below the shrouded housing. She'd learned from the last lock and attacked the chain instead. The padlock held, but the chain didn't. She pulled the chain free, opened the door, and went inside. That was 42 minutes ago. She was still in there. I got out of the truck quietly. I didn't slam the door. I walked across the yard in the dark, my boots soft on the grass, and came around the back of the house to the cellar entrance. The stone steps descended into the hillside, lit from below by Sandra's flashlight. I could hear her inside, the click of her phone camera, the rustle of her clipboard, the clink of mason jars being moved on the shelves. She was conducting her inspection. I stood at the top of the steps and looked down. There she was, crouched between my shelves, flashlight in one hand, clipboard in the other, photographing my canned goods like she was cataloging evidence for a trial. She hadn't heard me. I didn't say a word. I reached for the heavy oak door, swung it closed, and dropped the steel crossbar into the brackets. The door sealed with a heavy thunk. The crossbar settled with a metallic clang that echoed off the stone walls. Then I pulled out my phone and dialed the Polk County Sheriff. On Sweetwater Hale on Sweetwater Ridge Road. I've got a woman who broke into my root cellar with bolt cutters. She's still inside. The door is secured. I'll be waiting in the driveway. From behind 3 inches of oak and 4 feet of packed earth, I heard a muffled voice, then pounding, then shouting. I walked to the driveway, sat on the tailgate of my truck, and waited for the blue lights. The deputies arrived in 11 minutes. 2 cruisers, lights on, no sirens. Standard response for a property crime in progress in rural Polk County. Deputy Wheeler was in the lead car. He recognized me in the headlights and parked next to my truck. I walked him through it, the trespass history, the trail cameras, the cut chain, the door. He asked if the person inside was armed. I said I didn't think so. She'd had bolt cutters and a clipboard. He asked if she was injured. I said I had no reason to believe so. He asked if she'd been in there long. I said about an hour. Wheeler and his partner walked around to the cellar. I followed at a distance. Wheeler announced himself. Polk County Sheriff's Department were opening the door, and I lifted the crossbar. The door swung open and there was Sandra Devlin, standing in the middle of my root cellar, face red, eyes wide, clipboard still in her hand, surrounded by 300 jars of preserved food that she had absolutely no legal right to be near. She started talking immediately. This man locked me in here. I was conducting a safety inspection on behalf of the Homeowners Association. This structure is a hazard. I have the authority to... Wheeler raised his hand. Ma'am, are you Sandra Devlin? She said she was. He said, Ma'am, this property is not part of the Creekstone Manor subdivision. You do not have inspection authority here. You are on private property without permission, and the property owner has provided us with video evidence of you cutting a security chain to enter this structure. I'm going to need you to step outside." Sandra stepped out into the night air, still clutching her clipboard. Wheeler's partner photographed the cut chain, the bolt cutters, still lying on the ground next to Sandra's backpack, and the open door. Wheeler read Sandra her rights and placed her under arrest for burglary under Tennessee Code 39-14-402, unlawful entry into a building with the intent to commit theft, vandalism, or another felony. The bolt cutters elevated the charge from simple trespass to burglary because they constituted tools used to defeat a security device. Sandra protested the entire time. She said the root cellar was a code violation. She said she had a duty to protect property values. She said her husband was an attorney and would have this thrown out by morning. Wheeler didn't argue. He put her in the back of the cruiser, closed the door, and walked back to me. "Everett," he said, "you've got everything we need. The camera footage, the cut chain, the bolt cutters, her physically inside your structure. This is clean. The DA's office will have this on Monday." I thanked him. I shook his hand. He drove away with Sandra Devlin in the back seat, and I stood alone in my driveway under a sky full of stars, listening to the crickets and the slow fade of gravel under tires. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and organized everything. I pulled the trail camera footage from all 8 clips, the 5 earlier trespass incidents, and the 3 cameras that had captured tonight's break-in from different angles. I downloaded them all to a flash drive and a backup hard drive. I printed still frames of the key moments. Sandra climbing the fence, Sandra cutting the chain, Sandra inside the cellar, Sandra being escorted out by deputies. I called Patrice first thing Saturday morning. She was at her kitchen table drinking coffee when she answered. I told her what happened. She set the coffee down. I heard the mug hit the table and said, "Everett, burglary in Tennessee is a Class D felony. She's looking at 2 to 12 years. The DA won't go for max on a first offense, but she's going to have a record, and the HOA is going to have a problem." I asked what she meant. Patrice said, "An HOA president with a felony burglary charge can't serve on the board. Most CC&Rs have a clause requiring board members to be in good legal standing. Even if they don't, the liability exposure for the HOA is enormous. If Sandra was acting in her capacity as president when she broke into your cellar, and that clipboard suggests she was, the HOA itself could be liable for her actions." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Good." Sandra Devlin was released on bond Saturday afternoon. Keith Devlin posted $5,000, and Sandra was home by dinner. But she wasn't quiet. By Sunday morning, the Creekstone Manor community Facebook group was on fire. Sandra had posted a 2,000-word statement claiming she'd been wrongfully detained while performing a routine safety assessment on a structure that posed imminent danger to Creekstone families. She described the root cellar as an unlicensed underground facility storing unknown organic compounds, which was technically true if you consider pickled okra an unknown organic compound. She claimed I had trapped her in the cellar against her will, and that she was exploring legal action for false imprisonment. The post had 68 comments by the time I heard about it from my neighbor Dale, who'd been scrolling through the group while eating breakfast. Dale called me and read the whole thing aloud. When he finished, I said, "Dale, she broke into my root cellar with bolt cutters. The sheriff arrested her, and now she's saying I'm the one who committed a crime." Dale said, "Welcome to the HOA, Everett." Patrice called me Monday morning. She'd seen the Facebook post. Someone had forwarded it to her. She said, "Everett, this is good for us. She's making public statements about an active criminal case that contradict the evidence. If this goes to trial, her own social media becomes Exhibit A. But we also need to address the false imprisonment claim." Patrice explained that under Tennessee law, a property owner has the right to secure their own structures at any time. I didn't lock Sandra in the cellar. I closed and secured my own door on my own building. The fact that Sandra happened to be inside a structure she had broken into didn't create a false imprisonment claim. You can't burglarize someone's building and then sue them for locking the door. To be safe, Patrice drafted a preemptive response. She sent a letter to Keith Devlin's law firm, because of course Keith was an attorney, a corporate real estate guy in Chattanooga who handled commercial leases, and probably hadn't touched a criminal case since law school. The letter stated that any false imprisonment claim would be met with a counterclaim for trespass, burglary, property damage, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It also noted that Sandra's public statements about the incident could constitute defamation if they contained materially false characterizations of the events. Keith's firm responded within 48 hours. The response was a single paragraph stating that Mrs. Devlin would not be pursuing a civil action at this time, and requesting that all further communications be directed to this office. Translation: Keith had read the trail camera footage descriptions, talked to a criminal defense attorney, and told Sandra to stop posting on Facebook. But the damage to Sandra's reputation was already done. The Creekstone Facebook group had split into two camps. About a third of the residents supported Sandra, calling the arrest excessive and defending her right to protect property values. But the majority had turned. Comment after comment questioned why the HOA president was climbing fences and cutting chains on a neighbor's property. Several residents pointed out that Sandra's actions had exposed the HOA to potential legal liability. One commenter, a woman named Diane who sat on the finance committee, wrote, "If she was acting as HOA president when she did this, then the HOA is on the hook. That means our dues are paying for her lawyer. I didn't sign up for that." That comment got 112 reactions, and it set off a chain of events that Sandra couldn't control. 3 days later, I received a call from a man named Bill Trotter, who identified himself as the vice president of the Creekstone Manor HOA board. Bill was apologetic, careful, and clearly nervous. He said the board had held an emergency meeting and voted 3-1 to formally distance the HOA from Sandra's actions. He said the board's position was that Sandra had acted independently and without board authorization when she entered my property. He asked if I would be willing to participate in a good faith dialogue to prevent further escalation. I told Bill I appreciated the call, but that the matter was now in the hands of the Polk County District Attorney, and that any dialogue should go through my attorney. Bill said he understood. Before he hung up, he said, quietly, "Mr. Hale, for what it's worth, I've been on this board for 2 years, and I've never been more embarrassed. The DA's office moved faster than I expected. The assistant district attorney assigned to the case was a woman named Rachel Simmons, mid-30s, sharp, no nonsense, the kind of prosecutor who read every page of every file and didn't waste words in court. Patrice knew her from a property dispute case 2 years earlier and said she was fair, thorough, and not impressed by Lexus drivers." Rachel reviewed the trail camera footage, the physical evidence, Deputy Wheeler's report, and the 5 prior trespass incidents documented in the sheriff's file. She charged Sandra Devlin with 1 count of burglary, Class D felony, 1 count of criminal trespass, Class A misdemeanor, and 1 count of vandalism for the cut chain, Class B misdemeanor. The combined charges carried a potential sentence of 2 to 12 years on the felony alone. Sandra's defense attorney, not Keith, who had the good sense to hire someone with actual criminal experience, was a man named Frank Eversole out of Cleveland, Tennessee. Frank was competent, experienced, and realistic. Patrice told me he'd reached out to the DA's office almost immediately to discuss a plea arrangement, which suggested Frank had looked at the trail camera footage and known his client's position was indefensible. While the criminal case moved through the system, the civil front erupted. Diane from the Creekstone Finance Committee had done exactly what she'd threatened to do in the Facebook comments. She'd pulled the HOA's insurance policy and discovered that the association's liability coverage contained an exclusion for criminal acts committed by board officers acting outside the scope of authorized duties. In plain English, if Sandra was acting as HOA president when she broke into my cellar, and the HOA hadn't authorized it, the insurance wouldn't cover any resulting claims. And if the HOA had authorized it, which would make the board complicit in a felony, the insurance still wouldn't cover it because criminal acts were excluded. Either way, the HOA was exposed, and Diane made sure every homeowner knew it. She drafted a petition calling for an emergency membership meeting to address 3 items: a vote of no confidence in Sandra Devlin as HOA president, a full audit of HOA expenditures during Sandra's tenure, and a formal resolution confirming that the HOA had not authorized any inspection, entry, or enforcement action on my property. The petition needed 20% of homeowners to trigger a meeting, 29 signatures. Diane got 53 in 4 days. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in June. Sandra tried to block it. She sent an email to the board arguing that the petition was procedurally deficient because it didn't follow the proper submission format outlined in the bylaws. Bill Trotter, the vice president, forwarded the email to the HOA's management company, Appalachian Property Services, and asked for a ruling. The management company's response was 2 sentences. The petition meets the requirements of Article 5, Section 4. The meeting will proceed as scheduled. Sandra also tried to get a judge to issue an injunction blocking the meeting, claiming it was retaliatory and designed to prejudice her pending criminal case. The motion was filed on a Thursday. The judge denied it on a Friday, noting that an HOA membership meeting was a private organizational matter and had no bearing on criminal proceedings. Sandra was running out of moves. The criminal case was solid, the civil exposure was real, the petition was signed, the meeting was set, and every homeowner in Creekstone Manor had seen the trail camera footage, because someone had uploaded the clips to the community Facebook group. And by the time Sandra's attorney got them taken down, they'd been shared over 400 times. I didn't upload the footage. I didn't need to. The truth had its own momentum now, and all I had to do was stay out of its way. The emergency meeting was held in the Creekstone Manor clubhouse, a cedar-sided building near the fishing pond with floor-to-ceiling windows and a stone fireplace that someone had decorated with a Welcome Neighbors banner that now felt deeply ironic. When I pulled into the parking lot at 1:45, the lot was full. Cars lined the access road in both directions. I counted over 60 vehicles. I wasn't a Creekstone resident, so technically I had no standing at the meeting. But Bill Trotter had invited me to attend as a concerned neighboring property owner with speaking privileges. Patrice came with me, wearing jeans and a blazer, carrying a manila folder that contained the complete documentation file. Inside, the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs filled the main room. People stood along the walls. The stone fireplace anchored the front of the room, where a folding table had been set up for the board. Bill Trotter sat in the center with 2 other board members, a retired teacher named Connie Marsh and an IT consultant named Dev Patel. The 4th chair, Sandra's chair, was empty. Sandra wasn't there. Frank Eversole had apparently advised her not to attend, given the pending criminal charges. Keith was there, sitting in the back row with his arms crossed and his jaw set, looking like a man who'd realized too late that his wife's clipboard hobby had become a felony. Bill called the meeting to order at 2 o'clock. He read the petition aloud. He explained the 3 agenda items. Then he opened the floor. Diane spoke first. She stood with a printout of the HOA's insurance policy and explained the coverage exclusion in plain language. She said, "If Mr. Hale files a civil suit against this HOA, and he has every right to, our insurance will not cover it. That means any settlement or judgment comes directly from our reserve fund. Our reserve fund currently holds $42,000. Mr. Hale's attorney has already documented property damage, harassment, and a pattern of unauthorized actions by our president. A reasonable estimate for damages and legal fees would exceed that amount. In other words, Sandra Devlin's midnight adventures could bankrupt this HOA." The room went quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people choosing sides, the heavy quiet of people doing math. A man named Roger, who lived on the street closest to my fence line, stood up and said, "I've lived next to Everett Hale's property for 3 years. His root cellar, his bees, his chickens, none of it has ever bothered me. What bothered me was getting a letter from Sandra telling me I needed to complain about them to justify her enforcement campaign. She came to my house twice, asking me to sign a petition against his outbuildings. I told her no both times. This isn't about property values. It was never about property values. This was about Sandra wanting to control someone who wasn't hers to control." Bill asked if anyone wanted to speak in Sandra's defense. Keith raised his hand, but was told that as a non-board member, he didn't have the floor unless recognized by the chair. He asked to be recognized. Bill recognized him. Keith stood and said, "Sandra was acting in what she believed was the best interest of this community. Her methods may have been, she may have, the situation got out of hand. She regrets how things unfolded." Someone in the middle of the room said, just loud enough, "She regrets getting caught." Keith sat down. Bill called the vote on the motion of no confidence. Paper ballots, counted by Connie Marsh and the property manager from Appalachian Property Services. The result? 97 in favor, 14 against, 6 abstentions. Sandra Devlin was removed as HOA president by an overwhelming margin. The second vote, the resolution confirming the HOA had not authorized any action on my property, passed 104 to 3. The third item, the financial audit, was approved unanimously. Bill looked at the room and said, "Thank you all for coming. I think we've made our position clear. This HOA does not authorize trespass, break-ins, or harassment of neighboring property owners. Period." The room applauded. Not a standing ovation, just a steady, solid clap. The sound of 100 people agreeing that enough was enough. The criminal case resolved in August. Frank Eversole negotiated a plea deal with Rachel Simmons. Sandra pleaded guilty to criminal trespass. The felony burglary charge was reduced to a misdemeanor as part of the agreement. She received 2 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a $5,000 fine, and a permanent restraining order prohibiting her from entering my property or contacting me directly. She was also required to pay restitution of $1,800 for the cut chain, damaged hasp, and my legal expenses related to the trespass complaints. Patrice filed a civil demand against the Creekstone Manor HOA for the harassment campaign, the letters, the frivolous county complaints, and Sandra's unauthorized enforcement actions. The board, now led by Bill Trotter, settled within 6 weeks. The HOA paid $12,000, enough to cover Patrice's fees, the cost of the upgraded security, the trail cameras, and a fair amount for the months of aggravation Sandra had caused. The settlement included a formal written acknowledgement that my property was not and had never been subject to Creekstone Manor's CC and Rs. The financial audit Diane had championed turned up something interesting. During Sandra's 3 years as president, the HOA had spent over $8,000 on legal consultation fees, payments to Keith's firm for advisory services related to neighboring property compliance. In other words, Sandra had been using HOA funds to pay her own husband to write threatening letters to people like me. The board voted to demand repayment. Keith wrote a check for the full amount without a fight, which told everyone exactly how indefensible the arrangement had been. Sandra and Keith listed their house in September. It sold in 5 weeks. The moving truck came on a Thursday. I watched it from my garden, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the deep, steady relief of knowing that the thing that had been pressing on your chest for a year had finally lifted. Bill Trotter served as interim president until the annual election in November. Dev Patel won the presidency on a platform he summarized in a single sentence: "Let's mind our own business and take care of ours." His first act was to amend the CC and Rs to include a clause explicitly stating that HOA authority extended only to properties within the subdivision's recorded plat. His second act was to send me a handwritten note that said, "Mr. Hale, thank you for your patience. We're sorry. Please enjoy your tomatoes." The root cellar is still there. Same stone walls, same oak door, same steel crossbar. I replaced the chain and hasp with a set-up Earl Gunter design specifically, a shrouded, hardened steel housing that he says would stop anything short of a plasma cutter. The shelves are full again. Last fall I put up 60 quarts of tomatoes, 30 pints of pickled peppers, 20 jars of apple butter, and enough smoked venison to get through 2 winters. The trail cameras are still running. I check them every morning out of habit now, the way you check a fence line after a storm, even when you're pretty sure it held. The images are always the same: deer at dawn, a fox at dusk, the occasional turkey strutting past the door like it owns the place. One evening last October, I was sitting on the cellar steps with a jar of honey and a piece of cornbread, watching the ridgeline turn gold in the last light. Dale walked up from the lower field and sat down next to me. He looked at the cellar door, the cameras, the new lock, and said, "You know, Everett, that's probably the most secure root cellar in the state of Tennessee." I said, "It stores canned tomatoes and smoked deer meat." He said, "And one hell of a story." I laughed, broke the cornbread in half, and handed him a piece. We sat there in the fading light, 2 men on a hillside, eating cornbread and saying nothing, while 300 jars of preserved food sat quietly behind a door that nobody was ever going to open without permission again.
What strikes me about Sandra Devlin isn't malice, it's blindness. She had everything: a leadership position, a trusting community, and years of goodwill. She threw it all away because she couldn't accept one simple truth, that the man next door wasn't hers to govern. That's the problem with people who confuse authority with control. They don't just enforce rules, they expand them. First, it's your paint color, then your fence, then your beehive. Then one night they show up with bowl cutters, convinced their clip-on makes them untouchable. At first it didn't escalate, he documented, he didn't threaten, he prepared. He never argued with Sandra's letter or her Facebook post. He just installed trail cameras, upgraded his locks, and let the truth do what it always does when you give it enough time and evidence. Speak for itself. The real lesson here has nothing to do with root cellar or barbed wire. It's about patience, documentation, and understanding that the strongest position in any dispute is doing nothing wrong and being able to prove it. Everett didn't need to raise his voice. He needed a $300 trail camera and a filmation judge. If your HOA has ever overstepped its legal boundaries, stop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And subscribe because next week I'm covering the HOA that tried to demolish a veteran's workshop where he was deployed. What his wife did with the surveyor's report and retired judge will leave you unspeechless.